Welcome, everyone. We are a little bit delayed this evening, but with very good reason, because our fabulous Congresswoman in District 5 is hard at work at the Capitol. In fact, she has just dashed out for a few minutes to share herself with us. So thank you so much for being here. We truly appreciate it.
Thanks. Great to talk to you, Eleni.
Yes, it's good. Always good to see you, my friend. So first, I want to ask, how is Milford? All recovered? Everything's good with you guys at your house? Everybody's well?
Yes, my family is wonderful. Thank you so much for asking.
Good.
Milford's good, all recovered. He's actually back to work.
Of course. There's no shortage of hardworking folks in your house.
No.
So I was
Exactly.
saying that part of the reason you couldn't be here at 6 tonight was because you were voting, and I know that you were voting on an infrastructure bill. So good things for Connecticut, I hope, coming this way.
Actually, I'm still voting. I'm literally watching the floor on one phone and talking to you on the other. I had to run out and get in my car and literally drive off campus so that I could have this conversation. But I'm really excited because we are bringing, it's about a $1.5 trillion infrastructure package to the floor. And there's some really important components that would help out our state specifically. The school infrastructure plan is a part of it, which I'm super excited about. It has a lot of broadband and connectivity components. I'm working really hard. There were some concerns for local farmers for transporting food products within the state. So there's a very Connecticut specific amendment that looks like we're going to try to get passed.
Wonderful.
So it really is a compilation of everything that we've heard. And really, I'm trying to find the bright spot in what we're talking about with COVID. And I think the bright spot for me is that so many of those deep cracks that we've been talking about for years have been exposed in such a way that no one can turn a blind eye now. So we are really putting forth an aggressive infrastructure package to address many of these things that we already knew existed. But as a result of COVID-19, we just see the gaping holes in our communities.
Well, and that speaks to one of the topics that I definitely wanted to bring up, in that, we had all these kids home from school. We had connectivity issues for families. We had lots of kids who didn't have the laptops they needed, kids that were not getting the equitable education. It was good in some towns. It wasn't great in other towns. And now you've been very outspoken in the last few days. While I think we all could agree, a plan has to start somewhere. But you have concerns about this plan, and I wanted to ask you, where you are in terms of now that the plan, it's a little more fleshed out, but not entirely.
Well, I mean, I've dedicated my life to educational equity, so this is real and important, and it's deeply personal for me. So I waited in anticipation for, like everyone. So I did see the plan yesterday, and my intent is not to be critical of the governor's efforts or what people are doing, but just to be honest about the real questions I have. And I want to make sure that not only our students and families feel confident, but that teachers also feel safe. And then I think the other part is I really want to know is, as a federal legislator, what can I do to help? How can I use my agency and, my voice at the federal level to support state and local districts? I mean, to support the state education and our local districts. And that I really wanted to be a part of that ongoing conversation because, as you said, the divide is deep. I have school districts within my district where some went online after a couple of days and others are still waiting for computers, where kids, they just lost kids. I'm concerned about how do we address the trauma that kids have dealt with over the last couple months. If we're concerned about teacher layoffs and support services with guidance counselors and all of those wraparound things, I'm concerned that there was no, this idea that testing doesn't solve all the problems. Yes, I get it, but I think there should be some level of confidence if someone wants to be tested or feels like they're exhibiting symptoms. And a lot of these things we're kind of developing as we go along. But, for as much as we can, I think we have to imagine every possible scenario. But again, always trying to look for the bright side. I'm so happy that there is this focus on the opportunity gap and the equity gap and losing academic time, because these are all the things that I've been talking about for the last 15 years.
Mhm.
So I love it that everybody is saying, well, wait a minute, we have to get kids back to school because the achievement gap is growing wider, or, you know, the opportunity gap is growing wider, or they're not connected at home, or they're not eating at home. And it's like, this is what I've been trying to tell you. So there is a national conversation that I'm really excited is happening. And again, we cannot just put the lid back on and return back to February 2020. You know, that I won't allow that to happen. We have to begin to address those systemic inequities that exist. I mean, I have some of the most segregated housing in Connecticut 5, the most segregated schools in Connecticut 5, and that's not blame placing. It's just, you know, analyzing the data and saying, where do we go from here?
And I think that there is some surprise for people in terms of they assume a certain town will not have equity issues, or they will assume the kids have food on the table at home because they live in a certain zip code. And I will say this has been in a lot of ways, when you talk about, you know, we're not going back to February 2020, this has been the great equalizer for a lot of things. And so it makes the conversation harder and easier, I think.
Right,
Yep.
exactly. Because for me, there are many parts of this that are a little bit easier to have because more people understand. There are so many other players in this conversation. Yeah. And you'd be surprised. It's not just our urban areas that are struggling. We have people who, for the first time in their lifetime, are getting food from food banks or seeking public assistance or trying to get some support just until they get back on their feet. And that's a humbling experience, but it helps people to understand some of the experiences of their neighbors. And I think I've been saying that what COVID has done for us is almost a reset of our communal morality. Mm-hmm. Because as a community, we're understanding and appreciating that we all have some responsibility to our neighbors. We all have some responsibilities to other communities. We all have some level of responsibility for other people's children. And that is, I think, if there's any bright spot that comes out of this, I think that really for me is what I'm looking at, because I hear people talking about, well, you know, we have a couple computers at our house and my kids could get on, but I'm not sure that's everybody's experience. How can we change that? Mm-hmm. So, and people who would have never saw themselves as being a part of the solution are stepping up and doing something. The Majority Whip, Jim Clyburn, he always tells a story about him and his dad driving in a car, and he has a South Carolina story for everything. But he said him and his dad were in the car and they came upon this tree that fell in the road, and he said to his father, somebody ought to move that tree. And his father looked at him and said, you are somebody. Great. And he was like, I guess that, and we got out of the car and we moved the tree, you know, that had fallen. And I think we're at this point where everybody is realizing, wait, I am somebody. And even though I can't solve the entire problem, I can do my part to contribute to the solution. And that, I think we'll be so much better off for that on the other side. And that for me is exciting. But it's also scary because, I mean, it is what it is. I think we have to make sure that we have leadership on the other side of this who is ready to make those changes, who understands that we can't go back to February 2020. We have to be even better than that. And that's going to take, you know, people who are in this moment right now and remember what this feels like 6 months from now, and don't just accept the status quo.
I absolutely think that's true. And we see it, you know, we see it where I work at Food Share in terms of how many people are showing up to Rentschler Field. Again, the great equalizer. And when you're talking about kids, I mean, you know, I think Glennon Milton Doyle, she says it a lot, but I've heard it before, you know, there are no other people's children. They're all our children, because at some point those children become adults. And if we want them to, you know, you and I have talked about civics education, you know, all of those things, it's also important. And, you know, you do have better childhood outcomes when kids' bellies are full, and you do have, you know, better outcomes when they have access to therapeutic care that they need when they have experienced trauma. And trauma comes in all different, you know, shapes and sizes. In fact, someone had asked me a question ahead of tonight, and I'm just going to read it for you, about how do we prevent massive evictions leading up to homelessness as a state and nation, and what kinds of supports are there nationwide for children who are in shelters?
Well, I think actually I just saw the state of Connecticut, actually the governor was ahead of the federal government on moratoriums on eviction. In Congress, we have, at first it was just for public and federally funded housing, but we've expanded it to all lenders for homeowners for foreclosures, if you will. But things like rental assistance, actually Congresswoman Waters was on the floor yesterday to try to present legislation on exactly what you're talking about. But again, this isn't just, I mean, when we did the Justice and Policing Act, I reminded people that it's not a single lens problem. It's not just about policing in our community. It's about all of our things. You know, the burden on some of our inner city school districts is because that's where kids are receiving all of their services.
Right.
So if we had health care and we could identify, treat, prevent medical issues before they became academic issues, if kids were hungry, I mean, their bellies were full when they came to school, if they had stable housing, all of the things that fall into different buckets at school or in the community, all of those things would be solved. So we have to, these are structural and systemic issues that we have an opportunity right now to begin to aggressively work on.
Yeah.
And I think we're looking at all of those things. I mean, when before we could make, I remember back in March when we were scrambling as to what next steps were.
Yeah.
A lot of the conversations surrounding schools didn't even start with academics. It was like, but the parents have to work and the kids have to eat and they need a safe place and the kids who are in a shelter need somewhere to go for the day. And I was like, none of those are academic issues.
Nope.
Those are societal and community things that we have to address independent of what we're talking about. So, I'm really proud of what we've done on the CARES Act and even the HEROES Act, because it really is a multifaceted, multi-dimensional legislation that addresses the entirety of the problem from all different aspects, because this is big. COVID-19 has just forced us to deal with all of these things at the same time.
Right.
And it seems overwhelming, but there's no way around it.
No, there's not. And in some ways, it certainly is not a gift in terms of, loss of life. And certainly people are having ongoing, the scary thing is hearing about how many people are having sort of chronic complaints after the fact, supposedly you're over it, but you're still having health issues. I think that when you look at the healthcare system and how broken it is, and prescription costs, and then you're hearing about, and I always say it wrong, but the COVID-19 drug, Respiradere, that, that they're going to charge so much money for, it's, again, we're back to an EpiPen situation, right? It's occasionally.
I saw yesterday.
Yeah.
Right. I saw yesterday, I think they're averaging about $3,000 per person with insurance. Yep. And again, you're absolutely right. The massive loss of life, I think over 125,000 people at this point, is unconscionable. And we owe it to those families and those communities to have a national strategy to make sure that we are better prepared, that to make sure that we deal with some of those systemic inequities that we saw. It's no mistake that the Black community was hit hardest by COVID, because there were all these healthcare disparities, all these housing disparities, all of these things that made them increasingly vulnerable for something like a pandemic. So I think hindsight is 2020, but we've learned so many valuable lessons. And I think it's incumbent upon all of our leaders from this point forward to make sure that these things are corrected, or at least we begin to address the problems that we're seeing and, have better outcomes for our community. And I remain committed to it. This has been, I can't even just, if there was a word, I haven't settled on a word to describe this term. I've run the gamut, but what it has shown me is that representation matters. We need people who are aligned in our values, who believe that all lives and all people have value, who believes that, our country is better off with immigrants and, the LGBTQ community. We have to protect those as civil rights, and healthcare is a right, not a privilege. And all of those things that we kind of say as hashtags have lived out for me in this term. And I don't know that I would even understand it any different way, but I'm so happy that I was here during this time, because I think that the type of leadership that I bring is what we need for this moment. So I have 36 seconds left on this vote. So
Okay.
they will close it right at 36. No, I was watching to see. Yeah, I think 40 other people have to vote, so they'll keep it open for a few minutes. But
Okay.
I'm so happy that I could join you, and I'm sure we can do this again.
Yes.
And I don't know, I'm not really sure what space you're in, but I need because it's like it's so bizarre. Like I have to leave the campus to do unofficial and official. It's weird, so I don't know how you are framing this program. But I think it's going to be more important than ever for us to have people like you on the other side, because anything that I do at the federal level means nothing if by the time it gets to the state, people don't believe that money should be spent the way that it was intended to be spent, or communities should be invested in the way that we are advocating hard for that to happen. So,
well, I will tell you, right now we have volunteers making calls as we speak. So hopefully, they're having great conversations tonight as we're having a great conversation. Anybody who maybe wasn't able to log on, we're going to keep this pinned to the Facebook page so that they can see it for the next little bit. And I just thank you so much. Hopefully maybe in September we can regroup.
Look, I'm going to vote on infrastructure for us.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Care.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Take care.